Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And in particular, thank you to the City of San Diego Fire and Rescue for joining us to talk about this important topic. I know that we've partnered to host some webinars on the new fire inspection program as a whole and touched a little bit on the alarm retrofit, but this is going to do serve as a deeper dive into that. And I want to say a special thank you to Doug Perry, who I believe, hopefully I don't butcher your title, Deputy Fire Chief, who's going to join us here. And I'm going to turn it over to him to, in just a second here, to kind of kick it off and explain from a higher level why this is happening. And then after that, we'll turn it over to Daniel and Mark, who are also on this call, to go more into the specific requirements and what have you. I will say, please wait till they go through their presentation and then enter your questions in the Q&A feature in the chat. I will be monitoring both, and then I'll read those live for Mark and Daniel to answer. But with all that said, I'd like to welcome everybody and turn it over to Doug to kick it off. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Molly. Appreciate, and first, thank you to you for setting up this webinar, because this is a topic that there's probably a lot of information that needs to be shared, and I don't know that that information has been out there as of now. I'd just like to introduce, I have two other my staff with me, Mark Dossett, who is an assistant fire marshal in the department, and Mark is also an individual that is very attuned and in touch with the codes and how they work and the processes. And so any of the code questions Mark will be able to answer. And he's got 30 plus years in the community risk reduction division. So he's got a history also within the department. And then the other individual is Daniel Hypes. He's a supervising deputy fire marshal within the community risk reduction. And Dan has been involved and working very closely with an individual by the name of Scott Hayworth out of DSD to try to figure out how best to implement the retrofits, how to permit the retrofits, and he's going to be doing a 9 or 10 slide presentation. And at the end, we'll have a question and answers. And I apologize up front. I'm going to have to leave early around 10:30 or 10:45. I have another meeting I have to go to. So let me get started by saying, why are you seeing us now on some of the apartment complexes? There was a Senate Bill 1205 that was approved by the governor September 27th, 2018. And that basically said that all fire departments are required to do the state mandatory inspections. And what changed is we have to report back to our elected officials annually on the percentages of these mandatory inspections by the state fire marshal that we're accomplishing. So in the past, it was a policy in the city of San Diego at the time, Fire Prevention Bureau, that the only apartment complexes that we inspected were those that had sprinkler systems or had alarm systems. So what we're finding is, and that number, I don't have the exact, but once we went to this new standard where it's 3 units or more, we found we have thousands of apartment complexes that have not been inspected by us. So we're still trying to get our hands around how many apartment complexes do we have, how many are we inspecting, so that we can report that back to the electeds. So that's kind of how we got here. The Chapter 11 in the fire code, existing buildings, the requirement for retrofitting alarm systems has been around for a very, very long time. The reason it hasn't happened in San Diego is because we weren't doing the inspections, and now we're mandated to do the inspections. So with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to Daniel so that he can put up the PowerPoint and give you the presentation. And then after Daniel is finished, we'll answer any and all questions that come. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
All right, thanks, Chief. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so like Chief said, he kind of went into the background of how we got here. So I just have a quick PowerPoint presentation that hopefully will answer a lot of the questions that you might have already. Some of the questions like Chief said, I've been working on this since the beginning. So I've heard a lot of the questions you have, and I know Molly had some things she wanted us to touch on. So I'll do my best to cover them in this presentation, and then if you have any additional questions, we'll go through that at the end. But just to start back here, where this came from, and as Chief mentioned, this comes from Chapter 11 of the California Fire Code, which basically has all the requirements for existing buildings. So basically what it's saying here, Chapter 11, Section 1113.12.1, it says every apartment house 3 or more stories in height or containing more than 15 apartments, and every hotel 3 or more stories in height or containing 20 or more guest rooms shall have installed therein an automatic or manually operated fire alarm system. It also says, I won't read the whole thing, but it also says the system needs to be in accordance with the California Fire Code. So those are that's basically what we're going off of. That kind of gives us our criteria and tells us what needs to be installed. And what needs to be installed is a system that meets the requirements, that today's requirements in the California Fire Code and in NFPA 72. So that's kind of the background and how we got here. So just to summarize that, and again, kind of go over the scope of what's included in this. So this is going to apply to apartments, hotels, and motels that were existing on January 1, 1975, where sleeping rooms are located above the ground floor. The reason we have that January 1, 1975 date is because before that time, there were no requirements for fire alarms in apartments, hotels, motels. After January 1, 1975, there were requirements. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, but that's why, this particular retroactive requirement, it's only applying to those pre-1975 buildings. It also has to be a multiple story building. It only applies to multiple story apartments, hotels, motels, because it says people have to be sleeping above the ground floor. So we're talking at least a 2-story building where people are sleeping above the ground floor. Again, just to cover for apartments, anything that is 3 or more stories or containing more than 15. So it doesn't have to be both. It can be a 2-story with 20 units, that would need an alarm, or it could be a 3-story with 12 units, and that would need an alarm. So it's either or. And then hotels, motels, again, 3 or more stories, or containing 20 or more guest rooms. So that's kind of your basic criteria. If you meet one of those criteria, you're pre-1975, then this retroactive requirement is going to apply to your property. There are exceptions to this requirement. So I put the code language in here just in case we might share this PowerPoint later if you want to look at the reference, but just to kind of summarize that, if you look at the bullet points on the right, either a 2-hour or 4-hour fire rated wall that's separating the units could possibly be an exception for you. So the 4-hour wall is going to be for type 1A, 2B, type 3 or 4 construction, which we're most likely not going to see that in a typical apartment building. Most of your apartments or hotels, motels are most likely going to fall into a type 5 wood frame construction, and a 2-hour fire rated wall is going to meet the criteria for that. Basically, this is going to be a wall that's going to be running from your foundation up to the roof level of the building, or maybe even through the roof. And it needs to separate the building into fire areas where you no longer have the more than 15 units for apartments or the 20 or more units for hotels or motels. So for example, if you had an apartment that had 20 units, it looks like it would need a retroactive alarm, but you have a 2-hour wall right down the middle, dividing it into 10 units on one side, 10 units on the other side of the wall, that would meet the exception, and you would not need to install a fire alarm in that building. But again, that firewall, it needs to be the 2-hour rating, and it needs to run the entire height of the building and go to both exterior walls. And go to my next slide here. So just to cover this exception a little bit more. So if you feel that you might meet this exception, I'm just going to go through the process here of how we verify that. So if you feel that you might meet this exception, you think you might have a rated wall in your building, we're just going to ask that you provide a stamped set of plans to the deputy fire marshal that you're working with. Whoever's been out doing your inspection, who identified the need for the alarm, You can reach out to them, let them know that you think you might meet this exception, get a hold of those plans. So if you have them already, if you don't have them, you can request it through DSD. They can look those plans up for you. You can submit a request to them. We don't need your full set of plans. We actually would prefer that you don't send us your full set of plans. Really just the pertinent pages, the pages that we need to be able to verify that you have this wall, that it is a 2-hour wall, and we need to see where it is in the building and make sure that it's separating it, the number of units to below that threshold. So the pages that we would like to see would be a plan view showing the location of the wall. So it's basically an aerial view of your property where we can see the location of those walls, where they are in your building, and how they're separating the units. The details page showing the wall construction. So there's going to be a page that's showing that 2-hour wall, how it's constructed, and then it's going to give us basically kind of an identifier that we can find later in that set of plans to see where that wall is located. And then we're just going to want to look at the plans for each floor. So if you have a 3-story building, we're just going to want to see the floor plans for the first, second, and third floor and make sure that we see that 2-hour wall that's visible on each floor. You can just send the plans to us if you get it electronically. Just go ahead and send it over to your deputy fire marshal. They can review those plans for you, and if it meets that criteria, then we'll save it. We'll attach it to your file so that we know in the future that you already meet that exception. I would recommend that you save them as well, that you have your plans and you keep a copy of it, but we'll keep it on our end. And we just ask that you send it in something where it's going to be able to be seen and viewed large enough. We've got a couple of pictures. People have taken pictures of them, and when we try to zoom in, it's just not really clear enough for us to see. So make sure you send it in a format where we can zoom in and be able to see it clearly to identify what we need to see in those plans. So one of the things that you had asked is what exactly is required? Most of this is going to be determined. DSD, or the building department, they're the ones who actually will be going through the permit process. They're going to be doing the inspections on the actual installation. But just to give you kind of a basic idea of what we're talking about with this retroactive fire alarm. So it talks about an automatic or manually operated fire alarm shall be provided so that all occupants of the building will be warned simultaneously. So a lot of people have asked, and it almost does sound like it's kind of giving you a choice, like you can choose a manual or you can choose an automatic, and it's not really giving you a choice. This requirement is covering multiple types of buildings. It's covering apartments, it's covering hotels and motels. So there are some slight variations and differences in what's required between an apartment, which is an R2, versus an R1, which is a hotel or motel. So usually it's going to be kind of a combination of both of these things. There's going to be elements that are of, a manual alarm system and some elements of an automatic alarm system. So it's not really something that you as the owners are getting to choose. Like we talked about before, we said that it needs to comply with current code. So whatever the code will allow based on your building, if you meet certain exceptions, there are some exceptions if you have sprinklers, where you might be able to get rid of the manual pull stations. But without going into too much detail, you're most likely are going to have a little bit of a combination of both of these things. So the initiating devices, so both apartments and hotels, motels typically are going to require a manual fire alarm box, which are those red pull stations we were just looking at. Those are going to be located typically in the common areas. Hotels and motels, specifically in the corridors, if it's serving sleeping areas, is going to need full automatic smoke detectors throughout that space. If you did happen to have sprinklers or some type of automatic fire extinguishing system, those are going to also have to be tied into this alarm system. So if there's a water flow or something's activated, it's going to activate your fire alarm. Notification appliances. So the code requires you're going to have audible alarm notification in every occupiable space in the building. So that's going to be sleeping rooms, corridors, basically throughout the building. You're going to have audible alarms. Current requirements, you have to have the low frequency horns. There's no longer you used to see a lot of like the fire alarm bells. Sometimes it was just an exterior bell. Nothing was actually inside the sleeping rooms. Unfortunately, that doesn't meet the current code requirements. So it is going to be those low frequency horns that have kind of that 3 pulse pattern. That's what's required for today's code. And possibly also visible alarms or strobes in public use areas, or if there are certain units that are designated for hearing impaired, those might have to have those visual, those strobes installed as well. And then ultimately the system is going to need to be monitored. So you're just going to have to set up a contract with a monitoring company so that the fire alarm will not only notify the occupants, but it's also eventually going to dispatch the fire department. So the next thing, some of you have asked about, well, how do I close out my fire inspection? So if this is going to be an ongoing process, right? This isn't something that we're going to take care of in just a couple of weeks or months. This is going to be a longer process. So basically the way that it's been set up and how we're going about it is you're going to have your initial fire inspection. So the deputy fire marshal will go out there to do your annual inspection. If they identify your property as meeting those requirements, 3 or more stories, or you exceed the minimum amount of units, they're going to issue a notice on your report. So you'll receive an inspection report from them that's going to identify that code section that we looked at before, where it's requiring a retroactive fire alarm. And they're going to give you some time just to get a project number. All we want to see is that you're doing the research and you're kind of getting this thing started. So they will give you time and you can just work with them directly, figure out a time, maybe a 3 to 6 month time frame where you can go down to DSD, start working with an alarm contractor or a design professional, get something submitted to the building department, and they'll give you a project number. Once you have that project number and you've started that process, that will be enough for us to be able to close out your inspection for that year. Obviously, we're going to track this and for ultimately to get the alarms installed and completed. But the initial step is just contacting DSD and getting that project number. And that's going to be enough for the inspector to close out the report. They'll decide a time of completion, just kind of based on the size or the scope of your project. One update, because I know there's been a lot of questions, and for some of you that have been through the process before, you know that permits can expire after a certain amount of time. So for this in particular, building permits have been extended for up to 24 months. So you can have it once you get that project number and you start the process, that permit can be open for 2 years. It used to expire after 180 days. Now it can be open for 2 years. And if you have at least 1 inspection completed in that time frame, you can get an additional 12 months. So again, just work with your deputy fire marshal on this project, come up with a date of completion to have this thing done. But we want to give you time. We know that obviously this is, it's going to cost you money. It takes a little bit of planning. So we want to make sure that you have time to get it done. And especially if you have a larger building with multiple stories and you want to do it as a phased project where maybe you do 1 floor at a time or maybe 2 floors at a time, just to lessen the impact. Just work that out with your inspector, come up with a plan with them, and you should be able to have time to do that. When that required date of completion comes around, the deputy fire marshal is going to follow up, make sure that fire alarm has been installed. They'll look at the stamped and approved plans. And then again, just like we did before, we'll verify that. We'll save it electronically. We'll attach it to your property ID in our inspection software. And then that will basically, we'll be able to close it out and have proof of it for the future. And so the permit process, again, this is all going to be done through DSD. But the first step really would be to reach out to a design professional or a licensed contractor. Just reach out to them and have them come up with a plan. You can reach out to multiple if you want to get a couple different bids on it, or just work with a few different companies and see who you like and who you want to go with. But that's kind of the first step. The contractor should be familiar with this process. You know, hopefully they've been through this before. But if you wanted to start getting some information on it, you know, I would just say reach out to them. You can go online to Development Services website. There's an informational bulletin 506. It gives you a bunch of information on, kind of walks you through the process and what the requirements are. If you just want to, you know, educate yourself about how this process works and what's going to be required, you can take a look at that. Eventually you'll apply for a permit. So once that alarm contractor, once they come up with the design, with the drawings and all the pages that are required for the submittal, they'll put that package together, and everything's done online now. So they should be familiar with that process. DSD has been using the electronic submittals for a while now. So you shouldn't really have to worry about that too much as the building owner. That's the contractor should be able, they should be familiar with it, and they should be able to take care of that submittal. And then ultimately, you know, throughout that process, you'll be working with a DSD inspector as opposed to a fire inspector. The DSD inspectors will be doing the checks throughout the permit process. They'll be inspecting the fire alarm installation. Ultimately, upon approval, they will sign off that permit. And then that's the record. Once that is completed and signed off, you can then reach out to your fire inspector, and then we will close it out on our end. And that is pretty much it. So I guess we can open it up for questions now.
Great, thank you. That was very thorough. I'm going to go ahead and ask everybody, put your questions in the Q&A and or the chat, and I will read those for the team to answer. First question, can you please confirm this is only for the city of San Diego? Does it apply in other cities in the county of San Diego?
Oh, this is Mark. It applies throughout the state of California. This is statutory law in California.
And I think the other part of this, Renee, is that this presentation is specific to the city of San Diego, where they have already kind of started, or as you've seen, created a process. I don't think other jurisdictions have actually gotten to that point yet, but because of the new inspection requirement that Chief Perry talked about earlier, I think eventually it will come to other jurisdictions. Let's see, I have two questions that I need confirmation on. One, a 3-story apartment building with 8 units needs to be compliant, correct?
Yes, yeah, they would meet that criteria because it was the either or. So 3 or more stories or more than 15 units. So yeah, if they are 3 stories, then that would, they would need to have the alarm installed.
In the second part of that, what about a 2-story building with a carport, garage, or crawl space below the 2 floors of the dwelling units?
Yeah, so if it's, we do see a lot of those, and yeah, if it has a carport or parking, so that the first sleeping level really is the 2nd story, then yes, those carports, you know, if it's above ground level, they would be considered the 1st story. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so that counts essentially, those count as the 1st floor, basically.
Yes.
Got it. Are there funds or grants available to help with the retrofit?
I don't know, Mark, I don't know if you know, I'm not familiar with any grants. You know, not to say that there's not something out there, but I'm not familiar with any, or
Yeah, nothing that I'm aware of, because this has been in the code for at least 11 years. So if anything would have come about, it would have been a long time ago.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and you know, we have to admit that this is a code change that somehow really slipped under the radar. I think a lot of owners would have prepped for this years ago. When you say that all sleeping areas require the horn, is that each apartment or each bedroom?
Yeah, so every apartment, yeah, every apartment unit is going to have a low frequency horn. And again, DSD, they're the ones doing the permitting. And again, I don't want to get, you know, I wanted to give a basic overview of what the requirements are, but that's not really, you know, our agency with the fire department, we're the ones enforcing it, but DSD is really the ones that's going over the actual installation of it. So inside the individual units, you know, smoke alarms are required, and those have been required for a long time, and those are required in every individual bedroom, the areas right outside of the bedroom. As far as the horns, I can say for sure it does need to be inside of every unit. I don't think it's in every single bedroom, but again, that's something that you could reach out to DSD, to Scott Hayworth or Adrian Silva, and they can verify that. Unless, I don't know, Mark, if you have anything additional on that.
No, I don't.
Okay, thanks. We'll get clarification from DSD on that then. I think this is along the same lines. To confirm, smoke detectors in each sleeping area does not cover this requirement. We need to have a horn system in addition in every unit that is wired to an alarm company.
Yeah, that's correct. So I think everyone's pretty familiar with the requirement to have smoke alarms, but a smoke alarm does not take the place of a smoke detector, or, you know, smoke alarms not really part of a fire alarm system, because those smoke alarms are really just individual to those units. If that makes sense. So having smoke alarms inside your unit doesn't meet the requirements of this full fire alarm system, where you're going to have the pull stations and smoke detectors, which are going to initiate those horns inside of, you know, throughout the premises, basically.
Gotcha.
So individual smoke alarms don't meet that requirement.
And if you think about the individual smoke alarms, they're not hooked up to an alarm system. They do not go to a central dispatch center, and they are just to notify the occupant within that space. And part of this alarm requirement is if they have a fire, they want everybody in the complex to be able to be notified.
Thank you. The question is, do you have a specific contact at DSD who is familiar with this subject? I have found that many DSD staff are not in the loop. And I think, gentlemen, you said Scott Hayworth and Adrian Silva would be the folks to contact there.
Yes, yeah, they're both very familiar with this process. And like Chief said, I've been in, you know, pretty close contact with Scott Hayworth in particular, just making sure that we're in communication. And since we are kind of both working on this together, we kind of each have a role to play. So yes, Scott Hayworth would probably be the best contact with DSD.
And Molly, that was confirmed by the billing official, Kelly Charles, with me last week, that any of these questions she would like referred to Scott Hayworth.
Great, thank you. So Todd asked that question, and I'll circle back and try to get the direct contact information for him and circulate that to everybody on the call.
We'll get that for you, Molly, and send it to you.
Appreciate that. Question is, how much, ballpark, does this cost for a 2-story, 22-unit complex?
That would probably also be a good question for Scott Hayworth. I know he came from industry, so he's probably got some ballpark figures at hand.
Yeah, I'll just add on, I've talked to several owners and managers who have gotten quotes at this point, and it really varies. It depends, I think, on who you're working with. I've heard anything from, around an 18-unit building being in the, $20,000 to $30,000 range. I've heard up to $40,000 for, a few more units than that. So it just depends, on I think the building itself and which particular company you're working with.
And for the group that's on today, that is the reason that we at the city are trying to give you over a few years to be able to accomplish this. I know in business, if you can set a budget, it's easier to do than to all of a sudden say, hey, we're going to give you 6 months and you got to go find it. So I would tell you, if you don't have the funds available, use the timeframes that are going to be allotted to be able to best serve you, the people that are renting from you, and then you as a company also.
Thank you. Are there resources identified that show us what systems need to be put in? such as, are there wireless systems that wouldn't require destructive work when we need to deal with the environmental testing and remediation, since a lot of these older buildings have lead and asbestos?
There are some emerging technologies that have wireless. However, the resource there would be your fire alarm contractor. They're the experts that would be able to tell you what devices you need, how many you need, so forth, and discuss options with you. One resource, if you don't have a fire alarm contractor, is you can look at the California Automatic Fire Alarm Association. It's CAFAA, CAFAA.com. And that's the association that all the alarm contractors belong to in the state, and they may be able to direct you to a contractor in your area if you don't have one.
And if your contractor says that a wireless system would work in your structure, the city of San Diego is allowing it to be a wireless alarm system.
Great, and that's a great resource. We'll circle back and share that with everybody on the call to get you that link to that website. That's good information.
And I was just going to add, and whatever they suggest to you, your contractor or design professional suggests to you that you can use, just for general knowledge, all devices and fire alarm panels, detectors, initiating devices, things like that, all have to be certified by the California State Fire Marshal's office. So it's not like you can go on eBay and buy something from, who knows where. It all has to be listed by the California State Fire Marshal.
Good stuff. This question, horns and sprinklers, question mark, if not already installed. So it sounds like horns, yes, but sprinklers, that might fall under a different section of the code.
Are they asking? Yeah, so sprinklers, the only time, I mentioned sprinklers, sometimes if you have, and I'm assuming most of these places don't have sprinklers, but there are some exceptions. Just when I was going through, what was required, if you did have sprinklers, there are some exceptions to then what things would be required to have. But this, what we're talking about today with this retroactive fire alarm requirement, there is no requirement for sprinklers. That would be something separate. Sprinklers bring certain other exemptions, I guess you could say, to the fire alarm system. But if you are, Scott did, I have had discussions with him, and DSD would be open to, if you would rather sprinkler your building, if you meet certain requirements, sprinklering is probably going to be more expensive, but ultimately sprinklers really provide better life safety protection. So DSD said they are open to, if you would prefer to just sprinkler your building instead of doing this alarm, that might be able to take the place of the alarm system. Obviously, the sprinkler system would still have to be monitored, so you'd still have to have some type of an alarm panel that's going to report. But if that's something anyone is interested in, they could look at those, entertain those ideas.
Good to know. Who are the qualified contractors who have experience on this, and does SCRHA have recommendations? We don't have any specific recommendations. We can't recommend one company over the other, but it sounds like that link that the gentleman provided, the CAFA, is a good starting point if you don't have a local company you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're in the same predicament. We unfortunately cannot recommend anybody. It puts us into hot water real quick because the other guy didn't get recommended. I would just make sure that they're familiar with working in the state of California. Most local companies have that experience. But CAFA would be a resource if you're looking for a certified contractor.
Thank you. My tenants complained that at a prior complex, these systems gave lots of false alarms, requiring them to get up and go outside in the middle of the night. A real pain. Are these systems more reliable now?
I think, I mean, if a system is designed correctly, a lot of the requirements and the way that these systems, are set up is to minimize false alarms. Obviously, if you do have those fire alarm boxes or those pull stations, you can't really, it's hard to stop kids from pulling, I know a lot of the ones I went on was just kids pulling it. So that, unfortunately, you can't stop, but they are designed to minimize false alarms as much as possible. So.
Thank you. If you opt to install fire sprinklers instead, would the city require the owner to bring the whole building up to code?
Well, no, it would only as far as the sprinklers would go. In other words, it would not, installing a sprinkler system would not require you to install an accessible restroom and a unit on the ground floor or something like that. It would only pertain to that sprinkler system.
Thank you. It was a comment is that some local companies, the fire alarm contractors, weren't clear on what to bid. I think that, might have been early on, hopefully, and that now that DSD and you all have worked together pretty closely, that Bulletin 506 and Scott are kind of have the requirements better laid out so the companies know exactly what they need to bid. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think early on it was a little bit unclear. And again, just because of that language where it said a manual or automatic alarm system. So I think some of those companies early on, especially since these are older buildings, they weren't sure if just the old, put in a couple alarm stations and an old fire alarm bell just on the exterior, if that would work. So yeah, hopefully now that the message is out that no, this needs to meet current code requirements, it should make it really actually easy for the contractor because they're just installing it basically the same way as they would for any other new fire alarm system. It just has to meet current requirements. So that should, if they get a fire alarm contractor who says they're not sure what they need, they can just tell them we need a fire alarm that meets current code.
Thank you. Do you recommend that if we have not received a notice from the city or been contacted by the fire marshal, that we contact them or wait for them to contact us?
You can always feel free to reach out to us. Like Chief Perry said, we don't have everything in our system right now. So we're working on, we're eventually getting to them all. It's just taking some time. So you can always feel free to reach out to us and we'll get you in our system or in our database. And yeah, I would just start, whether we've been on site or not, you can always just start kind of planning for it and budgeting for it and know that it is a requirement that will come eventually. Yeah, if you want to reach out to us, you can definitely feel free to do that.
Thank you. Please confirm the 15 units is per building, not property. For instance, if a property has 2 buildings, each containing 10 units, this is not required.
Yeah, that's correct. It's going to be within a building. So yeah, if it's a separate building, then that would not require an alarm. If it's 15 or less per building.
And if those, however, if those units were in 3 stories, then it would be required, correct?
Yes. Yeah, if they were 3 stories, it would. But if they weren't, it was just if they were 2 stories, but they thought they were exceeding the number of units. It is per building. Those units have to be continuous.
Thank you. I am going to put in the chat a link to CAFA that was mentioned. It's the California Automatic Fire Alarm Association, and that's CAFAA.com. So thank you for that information. Let's see here, another question. Bulletin 506 comes up as dated January 2017. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's probably correct. If that's what's on the DSD website, that's just kind of the general informational bulletin for, I believe, for just installing a fire alarm. There is a new technical bulletin. I think it's Fire 9-9, if I remember, which DSD came up with, which basically covers a lot of what we covered today, specific to this retroactive requirement. But that informational bulletin, that's not really specific to the retroactive requirement. That's more just fire alarm permitting in general. But yeah, whatever is listed on their website should be current.
Thank you. Yeah, and that lists the bulletin, I think, lists the fees, right, that are associated with the permit. 506. Let's see here. Any other questions, folks? Don't be shy. You've got a great opportunity here to get some questions answered. While I'm waiting to see if anybody else types into the Q&A, may we have a copy of your presentation?
Yeah, I can. You want me I can just send it over to you, Molly, and
Yeah, if you
put it
email
away.
that to me, then we'll put it out to the group.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that.
Somebody asked, can you repeat the info on the technical bulletin? Oh, the number, I think what you said, fire.
Yeah, I think, let me look it up right now. I think it was Fire 9-9, but let me try to find it right now, just to verify.
Thank you. Yeah, and to everybody on the call, what I'll do is I will compile some links and information. I've been taking copious notes and send that out to everybody who registered for this, so you have some of that information.
And it is, Molly, it is Fire 9-9. So I'll send my PowerPoint along with some of those bulletins, and then I'll also send you Scott Hayworth's contact.
Perfect.
I'll confirm what contact you would like us to give out.
Yeah, please do. Personal cell phone. Just kidding. Let's see here. Is it required that the system have a 24-hour monitoring service?
Yes, yeah, all current systems, they're going to be monitored 24 hours a day. So it's just reporting back to to an alarm monitoring company.
And I think before we started this session earlier, Chief Perry mentioned that there were just 3 buildings that I think got exemptions because they had the 2-hour firewall in place. Do you know offhand, or can you give us a kind of a ballpark figure, how many properties you've seen get exemptions thus far?
Yeah, so I have reviewed a couple. I think it probably is, at least the ones that I know of. I think there were 3 so far who submitted their plans, and a lot of them were, they kind of barely were over. They were 2-story, maybe 18 units, 22 units, kind of in that range. And yeah, they had 2-hour walls in them, and it was pretty obvious to see that they met that exception. So we have, just had a handful so far. I think there are others out there that feel that they might meet that exception. They just haven't got a hold of their plans yet. But yeah, we definitely have already seen a few that, have met that requirement and have removed the requirement for the fire alarm from them. So yeah, if you think you have, it's definitely worth looking into, and it's a good thing to have your building plans anyway. So I would just say, if you don't have your building plans, it'd be a good thing to have them reach out to DSD and try to get a hold of them. And because yeah, it's definitely worth looking into.
That's a good point. So contact Development Services at the City of San Diego, and we can, again, get you that contact info. Try to get a copy of your plans, and it could be that you're exempt from this requirement. I did have an owner express to me that they thought that their building was of an age that where they weren't convinced that their plans would be on file at the city. If that's the case, I think Doug mentioned something about a contractor being able to go into the attic and do kind of an inspection to determine. How would somebody provide the documentation for that scenario?
Well, that's true. They can hire an architect licensed in the state of California or other design professional that can go in and make that verification and either draw up some plans or Dan, are you accepting an affidavit on that from a design professional, or does it have to be plans?
I think we can maybe talk to Chief about that. I mean, initially we were trying to get, best case scenario, we get the stamped approved plans. That's something we can maybe discuss if Chief is willing to accept an affidavit or something from an architect or somebody who's qualified to review that. I would be okay with that, but we'll see maybe what Chief Perry will allow.
Great, thank you. Well, I don't see any other questions here. So I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to City of San Diego Fire Rescue, your team, for joining us, Daniel and Mark, and please extend that to Chief Perry. Thanks for everybody for being on the call. I know this is an ongoing issue, and we have lots of interest in it. We will follow up with the presentation and the relevant information, and maybe we'll even look at doing another one of these down the road. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day, and take care.